ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tuesday Talk with Chautauqua, courtesy of the Greenville County Libraries, who have been providing this online presentation. For those watching at home, hello there, we're waving to you. And this facility now for many years. I'll also mention, if you didn't notice it on the way in, there are books pertaining to tonight's subjects and associated things in the back that are available for checkout if you'd like to check something out and learn more about this history that we're going to be talking about tonight. I ask you, so that we don't disturb the neighbors with phones going off, marimbas playing, chimes ringing, if you could silence your phone or put it on airplane mode or just turn it off. It is possible to do that. Some people, anyway. And then at the end of the evening, I will try my best to remind everyone to take it off of airplane mode so you don't discover the reason you didn't get the call back was because your phone's been on airplane for the last 2 days. So I'll try to remember to do that. Don't forget, you can get a library card here. For those who do not have a library card, they are available. Just like when you were a kid and you know how proud you were when you got your library card. You can still use it today. Everything does not have to just be online. We have over at the desk, we have magazines, we have postcards, we have business cards, all celebrating the Chautauqua here in Greenville, coming up the festival in just a very short while. You know, it's about a month from now, we'll have the 12 days of the festival. And our speaker tonight is going to be talking about Rebecca Mott. There is a card over there that she was kind enough to bring up from the Rebecca Mott battle site, the Fort Mott battle site. And on the back of this card, which are available over there, so help yourself to it, is a QR code that will take you to the official website for the Fort Mott site, where you can learn more about Rebecca Mott, learn more about the battle at Fort Mott, and all those details that you'll be hearing some about this evening. And now to our presenter. Tonight we explore the life of Carolina patriot and a Revolutionary War figure. She served with such distinction that the Daughters of the American Revolution in Charleston named themselves the Rebecca Mott Chapter. Our presenter is an independent researcher, author, and living history presenter who, in addition to developing and presenting story programs for schools, has also researched and created programs in which she portrays women of the past. Her current portrayals include Eliza Lucas Pinckney, an American farmer who pioneered indigo as a prominent cash crop in South Carolina. She plays Dorothy Sinkler Richardson, who is the woman famous for saving the life of Frances Marion. Interesting, we've all heard of Frances Marion, but who ever heard of Dorothy Sinkler Richardson? And of course, Rebecca Mott, our subject for this evening. As a scholar, she has co-authored the European Struggle to Settle North America in 1521 to 1608, as well as Eliza Lucas Pinckney, Colonial Plantation Manager and Mother of American Patriots, 1722 to 1793. Her very latest book is the Rebecca Bruton Mott, American Patriot and Successful Rice Planter, 1737 to 1815, which was published in 2022. Please welcome our presenter this evening, Peggy Pickett.
Well, good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Greenville. This is my second visit here. My son and his family absolutely love coming to Greenville, so they brought me up here once, and I just loved it. So I was very pleased to be able to come back. And also, my visit tonight gives me an opportunity to talk about one of my very favorite subjects. and that is the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. And so to begin with, I would like to take you back to a very specific day in the history of that war, to May 12th, 1781. The scene is a farmhouse on the south side of the Congaree River in the Midlands of South Carolina. There are 3 people standing in front of the farmhouse. One of them is a woman. She is small in stature and slender and has an air of quiet self-assurance. Her blue eyes look out unflinchingly from a face that is both kind and determined. She is 43 years old and a widow. Her name is Rebecca Mott. Standing with Rebecca are 2 men who will become icons of the American Revolution. One of the men is a South Carolinian like Rebecca. He is small in stature and wiry. He has knock knees that cause him to limp when he walks. His appearance is not impressive, but his dark, piercing eyes and steely demeanor command respect. You probably all know who he is, Francis Marion, known to future generations as the Swamp Fox. Now, standing with Marion is a much younger man, a Virginian. At the age of 25, he has risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. He commands a unit of 300 men composed of infantry and cavalry. His name is Henry Lee III, known to his compatriots as Light Horse Harry Lee. The 3 of them are standing in front of a farmhouse where Rebecca and a group of women and children have taken refuge. They are looking out across a ravine 400 yards to the south at a high bluff where British held Fort, where British held Fort Mott stands. Now, the fort is in reality Rebecca's house, which the British have commandeered and fortified to use as a supply depot. The Americans are very pleased. They're confident they can take the fort. Ironically, though, just 1 year earlier, patriots in South Carolina were anything but pleased or confident, because on May 12, 1780, the unthinkable had happened. Charleston had fallen to the British. Stunned patriots watched helplessly as British troops fanned over the countryside, occupying key positions in the state. All right, I don't know whether you can see this or not, but after a while, the British, okay, this is not well. Okay, British outposts stretch from Georgetown in the Low Country up to Camden, 96, and Augusta, okay? And the the British were finding very little resistance as they established these outposts. And the future of the Patriot cause seemed very dim indeed. But 1 year later, the situation had changed dramatically. And patriots who had once been in great despair now had a reasonable expectation of being able to drive the British out of South Carolina. But to do that, they needed to capture the supply depots along the Congaree River Road, which, there we go. There's the Congaree River. So the British supply depots are all along the Congaree River Road. Because if the supply depots are captured, then the British can't maintain their outpost in the backcountry. They're going to have to abandon them and withdraw to the coast. Now, Fort Mott was the principal depository for goods coming from Charleston intended for Camden, Fort Granby, and 96. Its capture was an absolute necessity, and it was Rebecca Mott who helped to bring it about. So, who was Rebecca Mott? How did she and a group of women and children from the Low Country happen to be living in a farmhouse in the Midlands of South Carolina in the spring of 1781? And what exactly did she do to facilitate the capture of Fort Mott? And most importantly, did the capture of Fort Mott actually lead to the end of the British occupation of South Carolina? Well, we're going to answer those questions this evening. So we're going to start with the first one. Who was Rebecca Bruton Mott? She was born on June 15th, 1737. She was the fourth of 5 children born to Robert Bruton, his second wife, Mary Griffith Lawton. Sadly, only 3 of Robert and Mary's children lived to adulthood, their son Miles and their daughters Frances and Rebecca. The Bruton family was a prominent, wealthy family in Charleston. Rebecca's grandfather and father were prosperous merchants and leaders in the community. For 3 generations, the Brutons had lived, worked, and prospered in South Carolina. And over the years, they had developed a deep attachment to the colony, and they felt an obligation to support and protect it. Therefore, loyalty, duty, and service to country were highly stressed in the Bruton household. And the country the Brutons felt they owed duty, service, and loyalty to was South Carolina. Now, they considered themselves loyal British subjects, but they were South Carolinians first. And Rebecca grew up in this atmosphere, and she, too, developed a deep sense of loyalty to South Carolina, her country. And she had just as much desire to support and serve it as the male members of her family. But being a female, her opportunities to do so were limited. Now, as a young woman, Rebecca was petite, lively, energetic. She was known for her conversational skills and for her gracious hospitality. But she was also a very kind and caring person. Eliza Lucas Pinckney once described Rebecca as a woman with a goodness of heart which has always influenced her to assist all within her reach. 4 days before her 21st birthday, Rebecca achieved her main goal in life, the main goal of most 18th century women, marriage. On June 11, 1758, Rebecca Bruton married Jacob Mott, Jr. Now, the young couple had a house in Charleston. They had a country residence, Fairfield, which was a rice plantation located 40 or 45 miles north of Charleston on the south side of the Santee River. They spent the spring and summer months in Charleston and the rest of the year at Fairfield. Right? Rebecca and Jacob would have 6 children together, a son and 5 daughters, but only 3 of their daughters lived to adulthood. So Rebecca is a woman whose life is fully centered in the Low Country. So how did she happen to be living in this farmhouse in the Midlands in the spring of 1781? Well, her connection to the Low Country came about from her brother, Miles Bruton. Miles was a prominent merchant in Charleston. He was reportedly one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. In August of 1775, Miles, his wife, and his sons boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. That ship was never seen or heard from again. In his will, Miles stipulated that if his sons were to die without issue, his estate was to be divided evenly between his 2 remaining sisters, Frances Bruton Pinckney and Rebecca Bruton Mott. Now, one of the properties the sisters now shared was their brother's very handsome, prestigious house in Charleston. And this is it, the Miles Bruton house. It's still standing at the same place in Charleston today. So one of the sisters, one of their families had to live in the house. Now, how they decided who that was going to be, I have no idea. But it was Jacob and Rebecca and their 3 daughters who moved into the Miles Bruton house. Now, while Rebecca and, while they were dividing up his property, they realized that their brother owned several plantations. And they thought that it would probably be just a good idea if each one of them had one plantation that belonged entirely to them. So they picked 2 plantations, Greenwich and Mount Joseph. Both of them are located in the Midlands. So in September of 1777, Rebecca signed over her half of Greenwich Plantation to Frances, and Frances signed over her half of Mount Joseph Plantation to Rebecca. So Rebecca now finds herself the proud owner of a 1,300-acre plantation called Mount Joseph, located on the south side of the Congaree River. Now, in the 18th century, married women could own property in their own right, but because they had no legal identity, their husbands had to act as custodians of it. Now, while Rebecca and Frances were busy settling their brother's estate, the War for Independence, which up till now had taken place, or the fighting had taken place mainly in the North, the war came to the South, right? In 1779, the British gained control of all of Georgia, and then they turned their attention to South Carolina. By March of 1780, they had reached the banks of the Ashley River, and they were planning to lay siege to Charleston. So at this point, many people in town thought it would be a good idea to leave and take refuge in the countryside, and the Motts were no exception. When they left Charleston for Fairfield that spring, they took with them not only their immediate family, but some of their female relations as well. So the group that gathered at Fairfield that spring included Jacob and Rebecca, their 3 daughters, 16-year-old Frances, 12-year-old Mary, 2-year-old Becky, their married daughter, Betsy Mott Pinckney, who was expecting a child in August, Jacob's sister, Martha Mott Dart, and her children, and Polly Bruton, who was Rebecca's niece by marriage. Now, later on, they were joined by Betsy's husband, Tom Pinckney. He was, of course, an officer in the Continental Army. He was in Charleston for the siege, but at the end of April, he was sent out of town on a special mission. So he was not in Charleston when the Army surrendered. Okay. Now, General Clinton, who was the British commander, rode triumphantly into Charleston after the surrender, and he picked the most handsome, prestigious house in town to use as its headquarters. He moved into the Miles Bruton House. Now, General Clinton was very pleased with the fact that he had captured Charleston. After all, he tried once before and didn't succeed, so this made him very happy. But he knew that there was still work to be done because he needed to bring the rest of South Carolina under British control. So he sent his second in command, General Lord Cornwallis, and his army out into the countryside to occupy key positions in the state. By the 18th of May, Cornwallis and his army had reached the Santee River. And while he waited for his troops, his supply wagons, his artillery to be transported across the river, he sent Banastre Tarleton and the British Legion on a special mission to Georgetown. Tarleton was ordered to chase away or take prisoner all violent enemies to the British government. And I know when they reached Georgetown, those loyalists were very quick to point out to him that 2 very dangerous enemies to the British government could be found at Fairfield, and that would be Major Thomas Pinckney and Jacob Mott, Major Thomas Pinckney of the Continental Army, and Jacob Mott, a member of the rebel legislature. So the British visited Fairfield at night, hoping to catch the occupants unaware. They were only partially successful, though, because they captured Jacob, but Tom Pinckney managed to escape. Now, they most likely took Jacob to Georgetown, where they tried every argument they could think of to try to persuade him to change sides, swear the oath of allegiance to the king, and help them establish a loyalist government in the area. And Jacob refused to do it. At this point, Jacob and Rebecca decided that they and the women and children that had gathered at Fairfield should relocate to the Mount Joseph plantation. We don't really know for certain why they decided to do this, but there is one good possibility, and that is that the British forced them to leave. It would soon be standard procedure for the British to relocate influential patriot leaders who refused to sign the oath of allegiance to the king. The British were afraid that if they allowed these influential leaders to remain in their home counties, they would set an example and others would be encouraged to defy British rule. Jacob was clearly not going to cooperate with them. They may have seen him as a threat and just wanted him to go somewhere else. There had to be a compelling reason for this move. It was between 80 and 90 miles from Fairfield Plantation to Mount Joseph. And this would be an arduous journey for 5 women, especially when one of them was 7 months pregnant, at least 6 children ranging in age from 2 to 12, any number of enslaved servants, and as their furniture and their household items. They took horses with them, horses that belonged to them and horses that belonged to their neighbors. And who knows, they may have taken other domestic animals as well. They would not have wanted to leave much at Fairfield for the British to plunder. Right? So it was a very difficult journey. It was full of hardships, but the group finally arrived at Mount Joseph in early June. Right? When they got there, they found there was no owner's house on the plantation. So they took up residence in a vacant farmhouse on an adjacent tract of land. And Rebecca and Jacob were fortunate. Among their enslaved servants were 4 excellent carpenters. They put these men to work to build a house opposite the farmhouse on a high bluff standing 250 feet above the Congaree River. Now, this is the monument placed on the site of Rebecca's house by a DAR chapter in 1909. It was May 12th, 1909, that they put this monument up to mark the place where her house sat. And when they did the archaeology there, the archaeologists found they had placed that monument right exactly where her house was. So somebody had to have known where that house was when they placed that monument there, right? So they thought by the time they got to Mount Joseph, they're settled in the farmhouse, things are going to be better. They're going to settle in and be able to relax, but that didn't happen. They had the hardships kept continuing, and they boiled down to 2 things: sickness and the British. The British actually were occupying Belleville Plantation. Belleville was 1 mile from Mount Joseph. So foraging parties are always calling at the farmhouse. They're looking for horses, fodder, grain, and other supplies. And then all of a sudden, the British decide they don't want Jacob at Mount Joseph either. They want him down on James Island, where they are holding a number of other influential patriot leaders who will not swear allegiance to the king. So in the middle of June, Jacob left the Mount Joseph plantation and went down to James Island. And as soon as he left, then the sickness started, wave after wave of illnesses, ending in November with smallpox. Now, by December, everyone at Mount Joseph is well, except for Becky. That's the youngest Mott daughter. Jacob Mott, who had been able to join his family in September, was well enough to undertake a journey to Charleston, right? He left Mount Joseph Plantation on December 6th. On January 7th, he was reported as having passed through Santee on his way back to Mount Joseph, and he never got there. What happened to him is still a mystery. We have no idea where he's buried or what happened to him. So then we don't know when Rebecca got the news that her husband was dead. But by the time she got that news, she'd already suffered a loss. Her youngest daughter, Becky, had died at the end of December. Sometime in January, the house built on the bluff was finished, and the ladies were able to move from the farmhouse into the house. Now, they were just settling in the new house when the British appear again. And they tell Rebecca, we're commandeering your house, and we're going to fortify it and use it as a supply depot. So according to Polly Bruton, Polly was Rebecca's niece, she related her experiences at Mount Joseph to Alexander Garden in 1783. And he included her story in his book, Anecdotes of the American Revolution in the South. According to Polly, the British commander, Lieutenant McPherson, allowed Rebecca and the others to remain in the house while the fortifications were taking place. But once they were finished, he asked them to leave. He said, now that Fort Mott is going to be used as a supply depot, it's likely that the Americans will attack it, and he did not want any civilians in the fort. So they all moved back to the farmhouse they had previously occupied. Now, just as they were leaving the mansion house, Polly spotted a quiver of arrows, which she described. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm really messing this up. Okay. Oh, there it is. Polly described the arrows as a novelty given to Jacob Mott by a favorite African. She took them with her for safekeeping, and when they got to the farmhouse, Rebecca stored them on the top of a wardrobe in the farmhouse, right? Now, meanwhile, the war is going on, and General Greene is now the American commander in the South. He is preparing to launch his campaign to retake South Carolina from the British. He ordered one of his most promising young commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee III, to join forces with Francis Marion and his partisan fighters to take the supply depots along the Congaree River Road, right? Now, on April 23rd, On April 23rd, Marion and Lee took Fort Watson. That was the first of the supply depots. And then they headed up to Fort Mott. They reached there on the 6th of May, and they found Rebecca and the others living in the farmhouse. Now, taking Fort Watson had been a real challenge for Marion and Lee. And then when they stood in front of the farmhouse and looked out over that ravine at Fort Mott, they realized that they were facing another challenge. Rebecca's house was a large 2- or 3-story building. The British had surrounded it with a wooden palisade that was 9 feet high. In front of the palisade was a earthen embankment or rampart that was 10 to 11 feet wide. In front of the embankment, there was a 7.5-foot wide, 6-foot deep ditch. 20 to 30 feet from the ditch was an abattis. This is a barrier of felled trees with all their branched ends pointing outward. When Marion saw it, he called it obstinate and strong. Okay, so what did Rebecca do to facilitate the capture of Fort Mott, right? Well, the first thing the Americans did was to set up camp. So it was decided that Marion and his men would occupy the area east of the fort. Lee and his men would encamp in the vicinity of the farmhouse. Okay. So the strategy for taking the fort was very straightforward. The Americans were going to dig an approach trench called a sap toward the north wall of the fort. The sap was going to be dug in a zigzag fashion so that the defenders would not have a straight line which to shoot at the workers. To the east of the fort, they were going to build up a mound of dirt, and on top of that, they were going to place their artillery piece. They had a 6-pounder with them. Fortunately, the British in Fort Mott had no usable artillery. When the sap had been dug close enough to the abattis, Lee's infantry with bayonets fixed were going to tear through the abattis and attack the north wall of the fort. Fire from the 6-pounder and Marion sharpshooters were going to keep defenders off the wall while the attack was taking place. Okay. So work on the sap was progressing nicely. And then on May 10th in the evening, a courier arrived with a message for Marion from General Greene. Lord Rawdon, the British commander, said, Greene wrote, has just marched out of Camden with his entire army, and Greene urged Marion and Lee to redouble their efforts to take Fort Mott. So the next day, May 11th, Marion and Lee pressed the men to continue working on the sap all through the night. But on the morning of May 12th, they realized that the sap was still not close enough to the abattis for them to attack. But they knew they had to attack quickly before Lord Rawdon arrived with a relief force. The space inside Fort Mott was very small. The British had built their palisades 2 to 3 feet from the house on 3 sides, leaving a small open plaza on the east side. There were now 184 men crammed inside of Fort Mott. If the Americans could set fire to the house, the British would have to surrender or they would be burned alive. Now, Marion and Lee had the unpleasant task of telling Rebecca that they were going to have to set fire to her brand new house. But instead of being upset when she was told, Rebecca replied, this is according to Lee's memoirs, that she was gratified with the opportunity of contributing to the good of her country and that she would view the approaching scene with delight. Now, those may not have been Rebecca's exact words, right? But I think Lee has captured her feelings perfectly. In the 18th century, women had very few opportunities to influence the outcome of a military operation. And Rebecca was having a chance to make a meaningful contribution to the war effort, a contribution that would, in all likelihood, result in the expulsion of the British from South Carolina. And she was grateful to have that opportunity, even though it meant the sacrifice of her house. Now, it was at this point that Rebecca remembered the arrows that Polly had rescued from the mansion house and that she had placed on the top shelf of the wardrobe. She asked Marion and Lee to wait, that she said, I have something I think might facilitate your mission. And what she had were combustible arrows designed to be discharged from a musket. They were actually called musket arrows. They were unusual in the 18th century, but they were not unheard of. They had been used to good advantage during the English Civil War in the 17th century. In fact, a 17th century historian described them as being good either for service on sea to burn the sails of ships or on land to disorder men. And since they were effective at sea, it's quite possible they were still being used aboard some 18th century merchant ships as protection against pirates. At 12 noon on May 12, 1781, the musket arrows were used to set fire to Rebecca's house, or to the roof of her house. When the British soldiers rushed onto the roof to put out the flames, they came under fire from the 6-pounder and Marion sharpshooters, and they retreated inside the house. Lieutenant McPherson had no choice at this point but to surrender. After the surrender, the soldiers rushed in, put out the fire, and saved the house. And by now, it's mid-afternoon. The ladies at the farmhouse are preparing for dinner. 18th century people ate their main meal of the day between 2 and 4 o'clock. And in a spirit of generosity, Rebecca decided that she would invite all the officers, British and American, to dinner, right? Now, Lee wrote glowingly of this dinner in his memoirs. And he said that although Rebecca, though warmly attached to the defenders of her country, the engaging amiability of her manners left it doubtful which set of officers constituted those defenders. So, our last question. Did the capture of Fort Mott lead to the end of the British occupation of South Carolina? Well, after the siege of Fort Mott was over, Marion and Lee parted company. Lee went back to Georgetown, that area around Georgetown, and Lee marched north up the Congaree River to attack Fort Granby, the last of the supply depots, right? On May 15th, he captured Fort Granby. So now all the supply depots are gone. They've all been captured. Lord Rawdon has already evacuated Camden, so now there are 3 British outposts left. There's one at Georgetown, there's one at the town of 96, and there's one in Augusta. On May 22nd, General Greene began the siege of the British fort at 96. On May 28th, Marion took Georgetown. On June 5th, Lee and Andrew Pickens took Augusta. Now, Greene had to withdraw from 96. He had to break off the siege because he learned that Lord Rawdon was on his way with a relief force. But without their supply depots, the British could not hold their position at 96. So on July 8th, they abandoned it. And the British Army relocated somewhere around the area of Orangeburg. So now all of the British outposts have been abandoned, but there is still a British Army in the field. They're located around Orangeburg, and General Greene wanted nothing more than to confront this army in a battle. But he knew that his men were weary. They had been fighting constantly since the middle of March. It's July, it's hot, it's humid, so he takes his men to the high hills of Santee, where they can rest and recuperate, and then he can make his move against the British, right? It's the British, though, that make the first move. On August 3rd, Colonel Alexander Stewart, who has replaced Lord Rawdon as the British field commander, and 1,500 men seized McCord's Ferry on the Congaree River. They then encamp at Belleville Plantation for the next month. And you remember Belleville is 1 mile from Mount Joseph, so any thought Rebecca and the ladies had of having a nice, peaceful summer has just vanished. Greene breaks camp on the 23rd of August. He's headed to Belleville to confront Stewart. But when he gets to the Congaree River, he finds that Stewart's gone. He's moved closer to his supply train from Charleston. He takes his troops to a little place called Eutaw Springs. Greene and the Continental Army, they encamp at Mount Joseph for a couple of days. Now, traveling with Greene is John Rutledge. He's the exiled Patriot governor of South Carolina. And when Greene leaves to confront Stewart at Eutaw Springs, Rutledge stays at Mount Joseph, right? The confrontation between Greene and Stewart takes place on September 8th at Eutaw Springs. It's the last major battle of the Revolutionary War fought in South Carolina. After the battle is over, Greene sent this message to Rutledge at Mount Joseph. We have a most obstinate and bloody action. Victory was ours. Of course, Stewart sending sort of the same memo and back to his superiors. So both sides are claiming victory, but the British do withdraw to Charleston after the Battle of Eutaw Springs. So at this point, the British, having had control of all of Georgia and all of South Carolina, now hold only Savannah and Charleston. Okay? That's bad news for the British. But there's even more bad news waiting for them in this little place in Virginia called Yorktown, right? The siege of Yorktown begins on September 29th. It ends on October 19th with the surrender with Cornwallis's surrender. The loss of all of the territory in the South, the loss of the entire army at Yorktown, that's the final straw for the British. The war begins to wind down. There are still skirmishes fought here in South Carolina. Men are still dying Civilians are still being harassed, but the end is in sight. In July of 1782, the British evacuate Savannah. And of course, on December 14th, they evacuate Charleston. The Treaty of Paris is signed in September of 1783, which ends the war. Now, the capture of Fort Mott was not a grand epic battle with dashing cavalry charges, cannons booming, and hundreds of men left dead on the battlefield. It was small, and it was practically bloodless. But it was a significant victory for the Americans because it changed the momentum of the war in our favor. Now it's the Americans who are on the offensive, not the British. 4 months after the capture of Fort Mott, the British, who had control of all of Georgia and South Carolina, only held Savannah and Charleston. And when you think about it, that is epic. Rebecca understood that. She knew how important the capture of Fort Mott was to accomplishing that goal, and she was very proud of the part that she played in it. She loved to tell the story, setting fire to her own house. She told it over and over again to her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. And it's a wonderful story. No wonder it survived through the ages. Okay, do you have any questions?
All right, we now come to that part of the show where we have questions from the audience. And I'm going to start one selfishly myself by asking, so after the war, Rebecca Mott, what became of Rebecca?
Well, Rebecca, of course, has lost her husband, right? So he's died intestate, so there's no will. So when things finally settle down in Charleston, when the courts are open and so forth, she has all of her husband's property is divided up among her 3 daughters. Now, Rebecca's dower was Mott's Wharf, a valuable piece of property on the waterfront in Charleston. That was put in trust for her when she married Jacob. It was in trust for her and her children. So that's her inheritance. And then she's got this things that she's inherited from her brother. She still has the Miles Bruton house, which she owns with her sister. She still has Mount Joseph Plantation. But unfortunately, Jacob, being a merchant, he was also a banker, he's got a lot of debts. And if the inheritance that her children receive from their father is going to have to go toward paying those debts, and that Rebecca is not going to have that at all. She sold every single thing that she owned to pay her husband's debt. She got her children's permission to sell Mott's Wharf in town. And she bought a rice plantation so she could support herself, and became an independent rice producer. Yeah, the plantation was called El Dorado. And eventually, her daughter and her son-in-law, Tom Pinckney, moved into El Dorado with her. But even at her death, she's still trying to pay off all of the debts because she's insisting on paying her children the money that they would have gotten that she got from selling Mott's Wharf. So she said, I owe each one of them so many £1,000, and and I'm going to pay that off. And so in her will, she says, I want my plantation and my workers all kept together until this debt is paid off. So she was a very determined woman. But she was successful. It was a small rice plantation, but she did very well with it.
So just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone over there or over here. Speak clearly, close up to your mouth in the microphone. It picks it up much better.
Can you explain exactly where Fort Mott is in relationship to Columbia and Charleston?
Okay. You can't really see that map if I get that up. Okay. The Congaree River and the Wateree River come down and then they meet to form the Santee. Well, right up just above where that happens, that's where Fort Mott is. How many miles from Columbia? 45 or 50? 45, maybe. I'm not real sure, but it's not that far because the man that owns the site of the Fort Mott battlefield lives in St. Matthews, and they always go up to, for all their doctor's appointments, they go up to Columbia, so I guess it's not that far. It's about 8 or 9 miles from Orangeburg, I think.
Your next question is on this side.
And I'm greedy, so I have two.
Oh, okay.
One, do you know why Stuart replaced Lord Rawdon as commander of the British troops? And secondly, where was El Dorado? Is that perhaps near Plantersville?
No, it's near, it's on the Santee River. So it's close to the, what is that bay that's there? Winyah Bay, is it? It's not too far from the coast, yeah. Lord Rawdon has malaria, and he was, when you get malaria, you keep getting the recurrent bouts of it. So, yeah, he was not feeling well, and so he was going back to England. And so that's why Stuart replaced him, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Da, 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 da. Ah, in the front, okay. You know, they say in class as a teacher, when you ask a question, you should always wait until the audience becomes nervous. And then someone's bound to try to answer.
Thank you, Larry. So my understanding in listening to various talks is that there's some of these talks express doubt on the flaming arrow story, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
I know some. If you were to Google it or something, you would probably find that it says that the arrows belong to Miles Bruton. That's what Charles Cotesworth Pinckney II, who was Rebecca's grandson, he told the story of the Fort Mott in like 1855, and he had heard the story from his grandmother who died in 1815. So I think somewhere along the way he got the names mixed up, because that's what a lot of people have said. Well, why would she have arrows that belong to her brother? I mean, why would she even bring them up there with her? But if they belong to Jacob, now that would be a different story, especially if they were given to him by someone that he admired or was a friend of his. And Jacob was a merchant. He had ships that were sailing, all over trading. So it's very possible that this man saw these arrows that somebody was using on board ship. Would be great, if you could burn the sails of your attacker, their ships. They're not going to be able to go anywhere. So, Steve Smith has actually found archaeological evidence for them. And there's also the Siege of 96. It seems like there's a British officer who describes the attack on the siege, and he says that the Americans had used these musket arrows to good advantage at Fort Mott because they've been able to set the barracks on fire, as he called them. They tried the same thing in 96, but it didn't work because they were able to put the fire out. So they are a thing. I mean, and they really, it really did, as crazy as it sounds, it really did happen. And they were an actual fact that these things existed. So.
Ooh, we got another one all the way in the back.
My question is about Rebecca's married and pregnant daughter, the one that had during the smallpox outbreak.
Yeah.
Did the baby make it?
Yes, both, Betsy and the baby both got smallpox. And Betsy was, and they thought for a while that she was going to die, but she did come through it. Now, not everybody at Mount Joseph would have been affected with smallpox because some of them had either already had it or they'd been inoculated. But I don't think Rebecca's daughters had ever been inoculated. Tom Pinkney was, when he was a child, he was inoculated, so he was okay. But yeah, and they think that little Becky, of course, wasn't old enough to have been inoculated, that she never completely recovered from the smallpox and then caught something else on top of that, and it just being so young. Yeah. But Betsy's baby, his name was Tom Pinkney, a boy. And yeah, he lived to be an adult and married and had a family, so yeah.
All right, any other questions this evening? Long pause.
All the way in the back.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That, that I've given a couple of talks where I was doing a school program once, and we were talking about writing, and so this teacher said, "Did they have crayons back then?" And I said, "I really don't know." So, of course, somebody Googled it, and they did. And I thought, okay, it's wonderful what you can do nowadays, so, yeah.
Let's hear it, please, for Peggy
Thank you.
Pinkett. I would like to remind everybody that in 2 weeks, usually we only have one program a month, but because of the weather, we had to cancel our Edgar Allan Poe program. So in 2 weeks, on the 19th, which I think is a Thursday, is it a Tuesday? Okay. So on the 19th, we will be having the program here this month on Edgar Allan Poe. So please feel free to turn out. What?